That would have been a staple for arcades back in the day. That sound design was so important with arcades back in the day because like you needed that distinct sound in order to draw people to the arcade machine. And the iconic Daytona theme must have brought a lot of people to the machine. Anyway, Daytona USA. This was another groundbreaking hit for Sega back in the day. Uh, the graphics for the time were unlike anything that I've been seeing in the arcade before. The sense of speed was tremendous, and the fact that it could render all these complex 3D assets at once, it was a big deal, and it's still one of the highest grossing arcade games of all time. Having it licensed to one of the fastest growing motorsports in the world, stock car racing, in addition to debatably the most famous track in NASCAR, and you had yourself a guaranteed hit. And another one that was ripe for porting to the Sega Saturn. Though, like Virtua Fighter, the Sega Saturn game is a compromise, and maybe even more so. But yeah, Daytona USA, it's essentially a stock car racing game where you take control of a race car and basically race a few times around a track. It's deceptively simple in its gameplay. If you think you can just steer your way around the corners like in any other racing game, you're going to find yourself slamming into the walls a great deal. Knowing how to work the transmission, the brakes, and gas in order to jockey the car around the track while maintaining your speed, it actually makes for a pretty deep game. Daytona USA was also really groundbreaking back in the day for the fact that it was one of the first arcade machines to have the dual machine setup where you could put two machines together and hook them up and have two racers race each other, which is really cool for the time. So yeah, Daytona USA is still a really fun game for the console, for the arcades. The Saturn version, on the other hand, you can kind of tell that they had to make some concessions in order to get it right. Not only are the graphics just a complete eyesore in comparison to the arcade version, there's a lot of pop-in, the detail is off, and it doesn't look anywhere near as good as the arcade version. The music is still there though, so it has that going for it. But the main thing that kills the game for me is the draw distance. It's just so hard to see what's up ahead of you. Like you can see that turn right there, just coming into view faster than you can see it. So yeah, Daytona USA did not do very well on the console. Though it is a lot of fun to play with the racing wheel that Sega put out for the console. Though the bigger issue with the Saturn version of Daytona USA is really the content. Sega was really reliant on arcade ports for the Sega Saturn, and the problem was a lot of them were just straight arcade ports. So anything you got in the arcade, that's what you got on the whole home console without much else in the way of added content. And that was a problem because in the arcade, you're paying 25 cents a pop to play, and if you wanted to master the game, you might run through a couple of bucks, but for a home console, you're paying 50 bucks for the game, so you need a little bit more, and this is a concern that Sega of America had, and it's one that Sega of Japan just refused to listen to. Daytona USA probably sold really well in Japan, and it did sell well here in the States, but imagine how well it would have done if they had added more substantial content to it. So yeah, that version of Daytona USA, not terribly strong, all things considered. As for... Now, they would put out an updated version of the game, Daytona USA Championship Edition, which definitely had the better graphics, though still some bad pop-in. But the controls were somehow even worse than they were in the original version, and though it did have some extra content with added cars and added tracks, it still didn't compare to other racing games that were out at the time. So yeah, it's debatable whether or not this is a better version of the game. The Saturn version of Daytona USA wasn't terribly well received. The arcade version was still very popular, and thus Sega would put out a few more games in the series. There was Daytona USA 2, and then Daytona USA 2001, both of which were on the Dreamcast. And these games definitely did a lot better than the initial Saturn version, mostly because the Dreamcast was such an improvement on the Saturn's hardware. Unfortunately, Sega would lose the license to Daytona after 2001, and though the game's arcade game would get an arcade perfect port on home consoles when the PlayStation 3 and 360 were making the round, I don't know if those versions are still available, because in order to keep those up on storefronts, you still have to have the Daytona license, which would be very expensive. So, yeah, honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of the Daytona series. I mean, the original is still a lot of fun in the arcades, but on home consoles, there are better racing games that you can play. But anyway, that's going to do it for Daytona USA, guys. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for the next game on our list.